Snow didn't fall like feathers. It fell like blades, each shard piercing, icy cold, slicing into the skin and quietly stealing life away. In a remote forest of Alaska, where the sun only sets and rarely rises, the wind howled through the ancient pine trees like the wails of a forsaken land. Beneath the thick snow blanketing drooping branches, a small creature wandered, its 4 legs sinking deep into the frozen earth. It was a bear cub, just 6 months old, its thick fur still pale yellow, not yet fully grown. Its name was Rune. Rune stumbled through broken twigs and shattered limbs, wide, teary eyes scanning the surroundings, searching, but finding nothing. No familiar call, no warmth, no silhouette it recognized. Its mother, who should have always been by its side, guarding and shielding, had vanished after the fierce blizzard 3 days prior. Perhaps she had fallen, or separated from panic. Rune didn't understand. All it knew was that this silence was more terrifying than any roar. It stopped in a narrow clearing. Ears pricked as the wind cut through, chilling to the bone. Then Rune let out a cry, a small, trembling sound, fragile enough that even an echo might have shattered it. But no one answered. The snow began falling heavier again. Rune shivered, its tiny legs slipping off a root and collapsing into the snow. It stood up once more, pawing at the ground as if hoping to uncover some trace of its mother. But beneath the frozen crust, there was only rotting branches and the ruins of the wind. The sunset dimmed behind the trees to the west, turning the forest into a black maze. Rune lifted its head, squinting in despair, and then, a strange feeling crept in. It stood upright, ears fully alert, back arched ever so slightly. Something was moving, not the wind, not falling leaves, but footsteps, soft, precise, and, circling. Rune turned its head. Darkness shifted. In the brush, 4 pairs of glowing yellow eyes snapped open. Then a 5th emerged. Wolves. Rune gasped. Its tiny heart pounded like it would burst from its chest. It stepped back, paws sinking into the snow. The wolves didn't growl, didn't bark, they didn't need to. All they had to do was wait. And Rune knew. This was no longer a forest. This was a battlefield. And it, a child with no protector, stood at the very center of the trap. The wind suddenly stopped. Only Rune remained, and 5 hungry shadows, inching closer with every breath. Rune collapsed onto his knees, eyes wide open, reflecting the faint remnants of twilight. The shadows around him seemed to come alive, not just vague shapes in the dense forest anymore, but true predators, wolves. The alpha stepped forward, a large male with thick gray fur and eyes that burned yellow like the first full moon of October. His ears were laid back, his jaw parted slightly, revealing sharp fangs glistening with saliva. Every step he took in the snow made no sound, yet Rune could feel the vibration through the ground. The wolf wasn't in a hurry. He knew the game had begun. Rune backed away, his tiny paws sinking deep into the cold snow, trying desperately to find a way out. But behind him were dense trees, roots tangled beneath the frozen soil, blocking every retreat. The wolves had calculated well. They had herded Rune into a dead end. A perfect trap. A low growl echoed from a sleek black she-wolf, thinner than the rest. She darted from the side like an arrow. And this time Rune couldn't dodge. A piercing scream rang out as her fangs sank into his hind leg. Rune rolled through the snow, tiny claws flailing, scratching at the predator's muzzle. Blood dripped onto the white surface, staining it a deep crimson. The searing pain running along his leg made Rune tremble uncontrollably. But still he struggled to his feet. The wolves didn't back down. They smelled blood. Rune's trembling only made them more excited. The alpha crouched low, then lunged. Rune raised a paw weakly. But it was too late. The massive jaws clamped down on his neck, lifting him off the ground as if he were a dried leaf. Rune thrashed, tiny legs kicking in the air, blood soaking his fur. The death shake was coming, the killer's twist. The instinctual motion that ends a life in one breath. The other wolves circled around, eyes glowing, necks stretched forward, waiting for the final moment, the irreversible ending of a lost life in the wild. And then, a roar. Not a bark, not a howl of hunger, but a primordial roar, so deep the earth itself seemed to shake. The wolves froze. Rune dropped to the ground with a thud. Out of death's jaws, his eyes flew open, turning toward that sound. Then the forest exploded like thunder erupting from the soil. A massive figure, blazing and wild, burst from the trees. A grizzly bear, a full-grown female, her fur a storm of golden brown, standing on end, eyes ablaze like fire. No one, no creature, could have predicted that an adult bear would appear. But even more shocking, she wasn't roaring at Rune. She was roaring at the wolves. And in that instant, Rune, still trembling, still bleeding, understood. What had arrived was not another predator. It was the line between life and death. And the wolves, those seemingly unstoppable hunters of the frozen world, began to back away. Rune lay motionless on the blood-soaked snow, his tiny legs curled up in pain, body trembling uncontrollably. His eyes were wide, locked onto the massive dark figure slowly approaching. It was not an ordinary bear. It was a storm of flesh and fur, a force of nature, and it had not come to hunt. The grizzly bear didn't roar again. She rose up tall, her entire body like a towering statue of iron, front legs lifting off the ground. The last rays of sunset glinted off her thick fur, bathing her colossal form in gold like an ancient god enraged. A roar thundered through the old forest. And this time it wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of territory, of protection. The wolves froze. The alpha took half a step back, teeth still bared, but his eyes had changed. He hesitated, then snarled again, ready to lunge one last time for a quick kill, until the first strike came. The grizzly surged forward like a flash flood. Her massive paw swept in a wide arc, and crack, a sharp, dry sound tore through the frigid air. The alpha wolf flew into the sky. His body twisted mid-air, then crashed onto the frozen ground. Unmoving. Silence. Only the sound of Rune's labored breathing, the wind whistling through the pine trees, and the footsteps of the remaining wolves, retreating. No howls, no fanfare, no signal of retreat. They just withdrew, as if they understood that standing before them was not merely a bear, but an undeniable law of the wild. The grizzly did not give chase. She simply stood there, eyes dark and deep as frozen stone, locked onto every last twitch of the wolves as they vanished into the shadows. No rush, no pity, no fear. Rune watched, stunned, his breath, thin as thread, passed through trembling lips. He didn't understand why. He only knew he was still alive. And that massive bear, when the forest darkness swallowed the last of the pack, finally turned to look at him. Not a sound. Rune whimpered, trying to sit up, his hind leg still burning with pain. His eyes met the bear's. No words, no clear signal. But in that moment, Rune felt something deeper than instinct. He didn't understand why the bear had saved him. But those deep black eyes did not carry a sentence. They carried a call. And so, in the fresh fall of night, amid the frozen woods and the blood still seeping from his wound, Rune understood his life was not over. But now, it depended entirely on the mysterious creature who had just pulled him from death's jaws. A question hung between the earth's quiet breaths. Why did the bear return? And behind that steady gaze was a journey Rune could not yet imagine. Rune staggered to his feet, each shaky step like a tiny leaf whipped by wind across the freezing snow. The bite wound on his hind leg still bled, every movement sending a sharp pain shooting through to his spine. But the fear was no longer for the wolves. It was for something unknown. Where was the giant bear going? And should he follow? The grizzly turned her back. No sound, just one slow, steady step after another. Each heavy footprint pressed deep into the snow like it was being etched into Rune's heart. Beneath the old trees, that massive figure led the way through the dense forest as if the path had already been chosen. She didn't look back even once. But Rune knew he was not being abandoned. Something unnameable pulled him to follow. And so he walked. Each step was a tremble. Each step was a cry from instinct. Don't be left behind again. Dusk faded away, and the forest sank into deep darkness. The cold gnawed at every single strand of Rune's baby fur. But he didn't stop. The bear's silhouette ahead was like a silent mountain, not fast, not slow, almost as if waiting. Finally, as the last light disappeared behind the mountains, the grizzly stopped. Before them was a small cave mouth nestled between two moss-covered stones. Dusted in snow, it looked like a crack in the earth, deep, warm, and, scented with life. A hidden den in the middle of a deadland. Rune halted. No more strength, no more breath, just a fragile little being swaying at the threshold between life and death. The bear entered the cave first. Said nothing, gave no invitation. She simply lay down, a living wall of warmth shielding against the howling wind outside. And she waited. Rune stared at the darkness inside the cave as if looking into the abyss of memory, his mother. Warm milk, soft embraces, now just echoes in the wind. He whimpered, collapsing onto the frozen snow. But then, a low, steady rumble came from inside the cave. Not a growl, not a threat, but a sound of calling. No words, but Rune understood. He dragged himself forward, leaving a faint trail of blood on the white snow, and crawled inside. And there, among the scent of dry moss and damp earth, Rune curled up beside a body warmer than anything he had felt since losing his mother. The bear didn't touch him. She just lay still, breathing deep, rhythmically. Rune trembled, but not from fear. For the first time since being left behind, he slept. Not from exhaustion, but from something that felt like safety. In the suffocating night of the Alaskan forest, Rune's soft breath blended with the steady breathing of the grizzly. And deep in the cold earth, a fragile life, for the first time, felt that perhaps the world hadn't completely abandoned him. He had simply been found by something that could not be explained. Dawn tiptoed through the thick leaves of the ancient Alaskan forest, casting pale light into the misty mouth of the cave. Rune slowly opened his eyes, heavy lids blinking as the steady breath of the great bear still echoed beside him like the low drumbeat of life. For a moment, Rune didn't remember where he was. He only felt the warmth next to him. The scent of dense fur, earth, and tree resin. Not his mother, but no longer a stranger. Rune wasn't hungry. He was so hungry that even his stomach had stopped growling. A sharp pain, a burning ache. It felt like something inside was being scraped away. He tried to stand, his legs trembling as if every joint had fractured. He edged toward the mouth of the cave, the light forcing his small eyes to squint. Outside was a sea of white snow, trees, and silence. No more howls, no more screams, but also, no food. The grizzly still lay still. But at some point, her eyes had opened, quiet, watchful, not speaking, not moving, as if she knew. Rune glanced at her, heart pounding, then looked back out into the forest. A terrible choice, an unspoken question. Leave this protection, or starve right here? But then, the grizzly raised her head. That massive head moved slowly, her neck stretching toward the cave's mouth. She stood. Rune startled and stepped back. But the grizzly didn't turn toward him. She walked out, disappearing behind the pine trees. Rune panicked. He had been left once before. It couldn't happen again. He dragged himself to the entrance, teeth chattering in the freezing wind. The snow reached his knees. The cold cut like knives. No sign of the grizzly. Rune whimpered, a choking cry swallowed by the howling wind. Then suddenly, a sound, heavy footsteps crushing the snow. And then, she appeared. The grizzly returned, breath puffing visibly, frost clinging to her muzzle. And in her mouth, a dead hare. Bright red blood staining the white snow. Rune stood frozen. The grizzly placed the prey at the entrance of the cave. And then, she didn't eat. She simply lay down beside it, using her snout to nudge the rabbit gently toward Rune. No growl, no claim, just an act of sharing. Rune approached, hesitant, shivering, then lowered his head, and tore into the first piece of meat in his life. The taste was bloody, strange, not like mother's milk, not like soft berries, but his body rejoiced, every cell surging with life. The grizzly didn't eat, she just watched. Rune ate in silence. Rabbit blood smeared across his tiny muzzle. He didn't recognize himself anymore, but he was alive. And in the quiet eyes of the grizzly, Rune realized he had been accepted. Not as a cub, not as a companion, but as a fragile being worthy of survival, worthy of protection, in a world where existence itself was a luxury. From that moment, he was no longer alone, no longer entirely astray. Because in that frozen wilderness, Rune had eaten beside the one creature he was supposed to fear most in the world. Rune woke up in the middle of the night. The moonlight trickled faintly through the mist-covered crevice in the rock, casting a cold streak of light across the ground where he lay. The wind whispered outside, carrying the rustle of the ancient forest and the scent of falling snow. Rune curled up, his thin fur offering little warmth. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Grizzly was still there, lying at the entrance of the cave, like a living gate separating Rune from the dangers outside. Her massive body formed a warm wall, shielding their temporary shelter in the forest. Rune watched silently, not with frightened eyes, but with the gaze of one who is learning how to survive, how to be still, how to feel. Grizzly didn't do anything, just lay there, breathing steadily. But Rune could sense it. All her senses were alert, sharp, guarding. It was instinct. Rune didn't fully understand, but he felt he needed to remember everything. Then suddenly, Grizzly moved. She raised her head, snout lifted high. It wasn't random. Rune sprang up, his small ears standing straight. The air around the cave suddenly tightened like a drawn bowstring. Rune heard it, a vague sound, very faint, very distant, but definitely not the wind. Footsteps, slow, cautious, not from a small animal. Rune looked at Grizzly, and realized she was hearing something Rune hadn't yet understood. Grizzly stood, no roar, no growl, just a sigh, as if she had known this moment would come. Rune froze. His legs wanted to retreat deeper into the cave. But no, Rune was no longer the timid cub from before. He stood still, eyes wide open, watching as Grizzly walked out of the cave. And then, Rune smelled it, a scent so familiar it clenched his heart. The smell of damp earth, of something known, of mother. Rune dashed to the cave entrance, nearly slipping on the thin layer of snow. And then he saw her. A large bear, deep eyes, fur rough with frost, slow steps, tired, but her eyes lit up the moment they found Rune. Rune froze, because standing between him and his mother was Grizzly. Two large bears, one his protector, the other his giver of life, faced each other in silence. No roaring, no contest, only the sound of Rune's heartbeat pounding like a war drum in his small chest. Grizzly didn't attack, she just stood there, gazing into Rune's mother's eyes with deep stillness. Then, after a moment of silence, Grizzly stepped back, just one step, but Rune understood, it was permission. Rune's mother stepped forward. Her gait was shaky but resolute. She let out a low hum, not a warning, but a call. Rune ran, no time to think, no time to look back. Just ran, straight into his mother's embrace, burying his face into that familiar fur as if clinging to all the life in the world. Grizzly remained where she was, watching the mother and child embrace in the snow. Then without a sound, she turned and walked away. No glance back. Rune looked up, and for the first time, he didn't feel abandoned. He felt returned, protected by Grizzly, allowed to survive, so he could come home. Rune nestled tightly against his mother beneath an old pine tree, where she had stopped to rest after a long journey. Snow had begun to fall heavily again, covering their backs in a soft white layer. The Alaskan sky turned a dull, leaden gray, and the wind howled in bursts like it was crying out an untold story. But Rune heard nothing except his mother's heartbeat, steady, slow, like a drumbeat calling him back to safety. She gently licked the wound on Rune's leg, where the wolf's teeth had once sunk deep. Her tongue was warm, slow, so tender it stilled the world. Rune closed his eyes. His legs still ached, the muscles contracting with pain. But he didn't complain. There was no crying, no resentment, only silent gratitude, that he was still alive, that she had come back for him, that there was something in this world stronger than the instinct to survive, a mother's love. But somewhere within Rune, another presence lingered. He remembered Grizzly, those black eyes like mountain stone, but not cold, the breath that smelled of forest and damp earth, washing over nightmares like a thick blanket. Rune remembered falling asleep to the sound of the wind screaming, his head resting against a massive body he had never known before, and yet he had not felt afraid. Grizzly wasn't his mother, but Grizzly had never hurt him, and it was Grizzly who had shielded him from death. Rune opened his eyes and looked around the forest. The snow had blurred all tracks. The wind had carried away the scent. Grizzly was no longer nearby, but Rune could still feel something in the air, a quiet emptiness, a kind of absence, not frightening, but strangely familiar. Rune's mother gave a low growl, as if to reassure him, But as she leaned down to lick his neck once more, she stopped. She lifted her head. She had caught it too. The scent of grizzly. No longer fresh, but still lingering in the wind. She inhaled deeply, closed her eyes, then let out a low growl, brief, nearly inaudible to anyone but Rune. It wasn't a call for friendship or a challenge. It was a thank you. A wordless language of beasts in a harsh, indifferent wilderness. And Rune understood. Beneath the thick snow and shadowed trees, two timelines had once crossed. A lost cub, a lone wanderer, and a moment that changed everything. When Rune's mother rose and began to walk again, Rune didn't just follow. He carried the memory with him. Of life, of loss, and of an unnamed bear, who chose not to kill, but to protect. And somewhere deep in the forest, Grizzly was still walking, leaving silent footprints that Rune would never forget. On the third night after their reunion, Rune quietly slipped out of his mother's embrace. She was still asleep, her massive body draped over the bed of decaying leaves inside the warm crevice of the rocks. Breathing heavy but peaceful, the snow had long stopped falling, but the cold still seeped into the bones. Rune stepped outside, each tiny footfall sinking into the soft snow. The moon had risen late, a sliver across the black sky like a cut, casting a pale light onto the forest below. Rune didn't know why he was walking. Not to run away, not out of curiosity, just something unfinished. He moved between fallen trees, weaved through thorny underbrush where moonlight could not reach. The entire forest felt as if it were holding its breath, every leaf unnaturally still. Rune stopped at the edge of a small clearing, where the snow had once been pressed down by massive footprints. Now faded with time. He lowered his head, pressing his nose gently to the snow. The scent was faint, distant, but Rune was certain. Grizzly had once stood here. Rune lay down, curling into himself, just for a moment, just to be closer to the memory. But then, crunch, a sharp crack shattered the silence. Not wind, not falling snow. Something was coming. Rune bolted upright, ears pricked, chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. A shadow appeared beyond the trees, not a bear, not a deer, not grizzly, a wolf, alone, silent, starving, perhaps left behind after that fateful night of the attack. Its yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on Rune like a sharpened blade drawn from its sheath. Rune backed away, trembling, too small, too weak, too far from his mother. The wolf crouched low, muscles coiling, ready to spring. Then, grrrraaoo. A roar, deep and thunderous, like the earth itself had cracked open. The forest shook. Rune turned and saw her. Grizzly, emerging from the trees, larger than any memory could contain. Her fur bristled, shoulders raised, black eyes blazing. The wolf froze, paws scraping at the snow, growling low. But one step, just one, from Grizzly, and it fled. Vanished into the darkness as if the forest itself had cast it out. Rune stood frozen, breath caught in his throat, feet rooted to the ground. Grizzly moved toward him, slowly. No roar, no charge, just presence. Rune looked up, the moonlight revealing the scar across Grizzly's cheek, a deep, old mark that spoke of battles fought, but never at the cost of compassion. He took a trembling step forward. Grizzly leaned down, sniffed gently. Then she turned, didn't wait, didn't beckon, just walked. Rune hesitated, then followed, not because he was left behind, but because he was chosen. That night, under the pale moon and thick snow, among howling winds and tracks in the frost, two silhouettes, one large, one small, vanished into the shadowed forest. A second journey had begun, where blood wasn't needed, only trust. The next morning, the Alaskan forest was veiled in thick mist, with quiet light slicing through the treetops like thin blades. Rune woke within the rocky crevice, where Grizzly had brought him after the danger-filled night. Outside, snow still fell, each flake drifting gently like whispers from the forest. Rune curled deeper into the dry moss, but his mind was restless. Where was Mother? Grizzly hadn't said a word, she never had. But Rune sensed something different in her gaze since last night. It no longer carried the fierce energy of a protector. It held something quieter. A waiting. Waiting for what? Rune didn't know. Grizzly had left the cave before dawn. As always, She went without a sound, leaving only her deep footprints in the snow, silent trails Rune had come to trust. But he didn't follow this time. Rune stepped out alone, guided only by instinct. A familiar scent floated faintly on the wind. So faint, yet Rune knew it. Mother. His heart pounded. His legs shook not from cold, but from hope. He began to run, through brush and over frozen streams, places where Grizzly had once shielded him from the blizzard. Memories came rushing back with every step, blurred between fear and warmth. Finally, in a shallow stretch of land where the trees stood further apart, Rune stopped. A large figure emerged from the mist, a gray-furred female bear. Her coat wind-blown and tangled, her eyes hollow with the weight of days survived. Rune didn't cry out, but Mother did. A deep, trembling sound, less a call, more a soul reaching for its echo. Rune charged forward. Mother lowered her head, pressing her nose to Rune's brow, breathing in deeply as if needing to confirm he wasn't a mirage. She whimpered, a sound Rune hadn't heard since that fateful day. They folded into one another as the wind passed over them, like the forest itself was singing. But when Rune looked up, his eyes instinctively searched for Grizzly. She was there, farther back, at the forest's edge, silent, not intervening, not leaving, just standing, witness. Rune's mother turned. Her eyes found Grizzly's. The two females looked at one another, one who had lost, one who had accepted, and now, a handover. No growl, no tension, only understanding, a quiet respect between wild things. Where instinct sometimes bows to something greater, compassion. Grizzly stepped back. Rune hesitated. He looked to Mother, then to Grizzly. His tiny heart split between two worlds. But Mother lowered her head and touched his shoulder, softly, firmly, a gesture that said, "I'm here now. You don't need to be afraid." Rune moved toward her, but he looked back, one last time. His young eyes met Grizzly's steady, solemn gaze. Then he turned away, toward the embrace that had birthed him. Grizzly stood still, in the forest where Rune had once called her everything. Alone again, but not because she was left behind, because she had returned life to where it belonged. And Rune, the little cub once hunted beneath the storm, had finally found his way home. After that heart-wrenching reunion, Rune followed his mother away from the land he had once called the place of survival. Each pawprint he left in the snow carried a memory of where Grizzly had traded wild instinct for the protection of a bloodless life. Mother led the way, steady and silent, but Rune kept looking back. Grizzly was no longer in sight. Only frozen trees remained, and gusts of cold wind laced with the scent of pine resin. Along the way, Rune tried to tell his mother, through small whimpers, through odd, twitching movements, about the warm cave, about his first meal, about the quiet eyes of the enormous savior. She didn't respond. She simply inhaled the scent clinging to Rune's fur, one not of the forest. Not of her. Yet strangely, she did not growl. She simply, slowly, accepted. When night fell again, they reached an ancient rocky slope, where female bears often den for the winter. The cave here wasn't as spacious as Grizzly's. The moss wasn't as soft. But it was home. A return to Rune's true origin. He curled up beside her. But sleep didn't come, even with his mother there. Even with the wind no longer howling outside. Something was missing. A deep, raspy growl. A slow, steady breath. A gaze that asked for nothing in return. Not far off, at the edge of the forest, Grizzly lay still, her massive body cast around. Dark shadow on the snow, silent, yet deep as a well of memory. She wasn't watching Rune, but she knew. She knew he was safe. She knew she was no longer his place to belong. And that night, for the first time, Grizzly returned to her empty cave. The old den where Rune had once trembled and fallen asleep beside a heart that beat not his own. But now, as she stepped in, everything had changed. The cold no longer frightened her. It was the emptiness that did. She lay down on the cold ground. There was no scent of a cub. No echo of tiny paws tapping across stone. Only the faint trace of a fragile life. Once stumbled into hers like an accident, and left like a miracle. In that darkness, Grizzly did not roar. She did not mourn. But somewhere, deep inside the heart of one who had only ever known solitude, a crack had formed, thin as a stream of water seeping through stone. And Rune, though returned to his own blood and kin, could not forget the path that had taken him from despair to survival. They would never fully understand each other. But one thing needed no words. They had left a mark on each other's lives, forever. And not even the falling snow could erase it. The next morning, soft rays of sunlight slipped gently through the cold pine forest. Rune woke earlier than his mother. The little bear cub sat at the entrance of their den, gazing up at slivers of golden light piercing through the treetops. But his eyes weren't searching for the sun. They were searching for a familiar shadow. Mother still slept behind him, her breath steady and strong. She had returned to be his safe haven, the place he was born. His true blood and kin. And yet, Rune couldn't forget the one who had saved his life in its most fragile moment. He lifted his nose to the air and sniffed. No scent of grizzly lingered. The wind had carried it away with the snow from the night before. But in Rune's mind, that warmth remained, vivid and whole. That day, Rune didn't wander far from the den. Instead, he began to recreate old habits, sniffing patches of moss, gently pawing at soft dirt, as if searching for a familiar corner from the old cave. Mother let him be. Perhaps she understood, or perhaps she was simply tired, after days of searching for her child in vain. By afternoon, she led Rune to the stream, teaching him how to claw at the earth, how to gnaw on bark when hungry, how to sniff for signs of prey. Rune learned quietly, but every so often, he glanced north, toward a faint, blue-green forest ridge whose name he didn't know, only that his heart had somehow stayed there. At that very moment, across the forest, Grizzly sat by a narrow brook. She lowered her head to drink, but every time she looked up, her ears perked, not in caution, but in quiet listening, listening for a sound she knew she'd never hear again. The clumsy footsteps, the soft huffs, of a tiny bear cub trying to follow her through deep snow. Her heart was still, but not empty. She knew Rune no longer needed her. And strangely, that didn't make her sad. She had lived a solitary life, never bound to a clan, never bearing cubs. The mothering instinct had long been buried by the brutality of the wild. And yet, within just a few short nights, a small creature had awakened something she thought had died. Rune was not her child. But she had protected him as if he were her own. Not out of instinct, not by law of the wild, but because of something beyond all instinct. And so, that night, when Grizzly stepped into her cave once more, she no longer felt it empty. Rune's scent had faded, but the imprint of him still lingered warmly in the earth. She curled up, breathing deeply, not to forget, but to remember. And somewhere deep within the heart of the old, lonely Grizzly, something strange had begun to bloom. Memory. Snow fell again, gently, silently, as if the ancient forest were laying a pure white blanket over every footprint of memory, erasing and yet preserving. Rune curled beside his mother in a new den. Higher up, farther away, he no longer trembled from cold, no longer gasped from hunger, no longer cried out in the night from fear. But whenever darkness sank into the woods, Rune would dream, not of his mother, but of Grizzly, of that towering, silent shadow who wrapped him in a nameless gentleness. Once, when the wind shifted, Rune paused on a snowy slope. His mother didn't notice, but Rune stood still for a long time. Because that scent, so faint it was barely graspable, was Grizzly's. He lifted his head, eyes scanning the distance. Nothing there but pine, cold snow, and fading dusk. Yet Rune's heart beat faster. In just a few short days, she had taught him about courage without a single word. That survival didn't always come from instinct. Sometimes, it came from a silent nod, a single step taken backward on the edge between life and death. As for Grizzly, she never returned to the old place. The stone den where Rune once slept beside her now lay colder, quieter, but she often passed a familiar forest path, where the earth still bore tiny tracks, where a trembling cub had once followed her shadow. Each time, she stopped, lifted her head to the sky, not out of hope, but to listen, for a breath that had become part of her memory. She still lived alone, as she always had, still fought, still hunted, still kept to the silence the wild had carved into her. But now, that silence was no longer lonely. One evening, as wind dragged black clouds over the mountains, she lay curled in a new cave, eyes half closed. Outside, the wind howled like echoes of all things lost. And in her dreamless sleep, she didn't hear the wolves' cries, didn't hear snow cracking underfoot. She only heard the soft, hesitant steps of a little cub, following close behind. Rune was gone, returned to his mother, to the life that was always meant to be his. But deep within a heart that once believed it could never love, something had changed. This was not just a story of a bear cub surviving snow and wolves. It was the story of a choice. Of a moment when the wild chose not to be wild. When a creature born into solitude turned back at the threshold between death and life. To protect, to warm, to wait, not out of gain, not from instinct, but simply because of the heart. And somewhere, deep in the forests of Alaska, a low growl still echoes, like a final whisper of mercy, echoing from a place that even the wild could never conquer. Compassion, however fleeting, can change a soul forever. This is not just a story about survival. Not just about a cub named Rune escaping the jaws of wolves. Not just about an old grizzly, long used to solitude, turning back in the cold and hunger to do something no one expected. It is a powerful testament that, even in a world where instinct and strength seem to rule, something greater still exists. Choice. Grizzly was not Rune's mother. She had no duty, no obligation, but she chose to protect, chose to wait, chose to share her cave, and in the end, chose to step back when Rune's true mother returned. In a world where the strong devour the weak, she chose to be strong without violence. Rune may never fully understand what that means, but he will carry it for the rest of his life. A scar on his leg, a memory of silent eyes, a scent of survival and of love. And we, those far from that frozen forest, we too can carry something from this. Because sometimes, compassion needs no words, only a moment, a decision, a single step back, in the stillness of falling snow. Have you ever been someone's grizzly? If this story touched your heart, please share it, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell, so you won't miss more true stories from the wild heart of nature. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary miracles come from where we least expect.